So I now want to move straight on and introduce Professor David Victor as our keynote speaker for day two. David is Professor of Innovation and Public Policy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. His research focuses on regulated industries and how regulation affects the operation of major energy markets. And much of his research is at the intersection of climate change, science, and policy. So his work is instructive to many of the challenges and opportunities presented to those of us working in developing hydrogen aviation. He's published books including Fixing the Climate and Global Warming Gridlock, and they've been released to both critical acclaim and high praise. And he has served as a convening lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Professor Victor, welcome, and please take it away.
Excellent, Dominic. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you today. And a particular honor for me because you're working in the space of hydrogen and aircraft. And when I was a graduate student at MIT, the very first technical paper I ever wrote was about hydrogen-powered aircraft. That was published in 1990, and I keep waiting for it to happen. And so I'm thrilled to see all the work that your great organization is doing. What I'd like to do today is take 15 or 20 minutes and talk about the big picture, which is how are we going to deal with uncertainty? We, on the one hand, are highly motivated to do something about the climate crisis. The motivation in particular for the UK government is quite compelling. So we're motivated, but what are the right solutions? And those solutions are essentially unknowable today. We can pretend that we can develop really complicated and sophisticated roadmaps that get us all the way out to 2050, and we can chart every turn, but that's ridiculous. We don't know because we don't know how the technology is going to unfold. And so what I'd like to do is make 4 remarks today in this address about how we deal with these kind of profound uncertainty. And in particular, I'm going to call this deep uncertainty. There's a classic distinction between risk and uncertainty in decision analysis. It goes back to the 1920s. Risk is when you don't know the exact outcome, but you know how to characterize the range of outcomes. And so you have a portfolio. We do that in the stock market all the time, for example. But uncertainty is when you don't know how to characterize the range of outcomes. And then the policies and the investment strategies needed under conditions of uncertainty or deep uncertainty, lots of unknown unknowns, those policy strategies are very different. And I see ZeroAvia in that light. And so I'd like to articulate that in a little more detail. So the first of the 4 things that I want to talk about is how do we solve these kinds of problems? So about 18 months ago, Chuck Sable and I published a book called Fixing the Climate from Princeton University Press. Academics, we publish or perish, and since I don't want to perish, I'm going to publish. And that book is about how societies solve problems when there's a high motivation to act and nobody knows what to do. Think about it as the climate crisis. But there are many problems of that type. And the good news in that book is we're actually very good at doing it. This motivation gets firms and governments to go off and create policies, run experiments in effect. The knowledge that you need in order to solve these kinds of problems is not centralized, it's decentralized, it's with individual companies, it's in individual markets. So people go off and run these experiments and they figure out what works and what doesn't work. They re-centralize that knowledge, and then they scale up the things that work. The reason governments and firms do this is not just because they face the kinds of policy incentives we're all familiar talking about, like carbon taxes or emission trading systems and so on, but because they face an existential incentive. They know that if they are not seen as taking a problem like climate change seriously, that they're going to get voted out of office, they're going to lose their license to operate, and so on. And the firms that are doing the most in this space, not just in aviation, but in oil and gas and electric power, they're all behaving that way. They're not just behaving as if they see a marginal cost of carbon and they're trying to optimize and internalize those costs of carbon. They're behaving as if this is an existential crisis. And that's good news. But the way they're solving it in the context of deep uncertainty is through experimentation. Chuck and I call it in the book experimentalist governance, kind of a wonky term. But it's something that's actually quite familiar. Take the ozone layer accords, probably the most successful international cooperation on any environmental issue in history, starting back in the mid-1980s with the detection of the ozone hole, thanks to work by British scientists. And then very quickly, international agreements that said, hey, we should work on the problem, and then some agreements with some initial targets. But nobody really knew what the potential solutions were. At the time, there were people thought it could be incredibly expensive. People thought it could be incredibly easy. We just didn't know. The conventional history is that we solved the ozone layer problem because it turned out to be easy. And so we scaled up those technologies. And that did turn out to be true, but it wasn't always easy in the beginning. The reason it became easy is because firms and governments working together, radical collaboration, they went off and ran experiments. And by luck, it turned out that the substitutes were easier to find than the conventional technologies. Most of what's happening in climate isn't quite like that. It's much harder, it's much more expensive, but the same basic logic applies. So, this is the first point I want to make, which is we actually have as societies a lot of familiarity with solving problems like climate. And I think all this talk about climate as a wicked problem, an unsolvable problem, and so on is getting in the way of serious problem solving, which is that under conditions of deep uncertainty, the way you solve these problems is that you go out and you run experiments. One of the things that's very clear, though, is that when people run experiments, they have to survey the entire landscape of possibilities. That we have a tendency to overweight the things that are familiar and underweight the things that are risky, unique, that are highly disruptive. And if we do that, then the experimental process is going to be too narrow. The discovery of solutions is going to be too slow. And the problem, in this case, the problem of climate change, is going to mount more rapidly than we would like. That's my first point. Second point is, what does all this mean for aviation? What I'm really struck by in aviation, I was in London on Monday and Tuesday for the Finance and Aviation Conference. What I'm really struck by in aviation is how much is going on. For all the complaining that's going on in the world that we're not doing enough about the climate crisis, and complain away, there's a bunch of industries of which aviation is one of them, where a lot is happening right now. So there's a tremendous amount that's happening. You've got all kinds of experiments taking place. You've got a lot of interest in sustainable aviation fuel and so on. My concern, my concern is that the aviation business, because at its backbone is an airline business that is a cutthroat commodity business, which is barely profitable in good years, that business is not a risk-taking business. That business, like actually many industries, is optimized to do things that are familiar. It's very good at shallow decarbonization, not deep decarbonization. It's very good at buying familiar kinds of engines, familiar kinds of fuels, familiar kinds of aircraft, but a little more efficient than the last ones. And by doing all that, you get a little bit more efficient, and that offsets some of the growth, ideally, some of the growth in passenger kilometers. That helps. We shouldn't ignore that, but that's not what's going to cause deep decarbonization. And so my central concern right now with regard to how the logic of experimentalism and problem solving under conditions of deep uncertainty applies to aviation is that the whole industry is optimized around doing the familiar and is wary about disruption. What I like so much about ZeroAvia and many other companies and initiatives in this space is that you're doing disruptive things. That also means that you're doing things that are highly selected against by the existing business model inside the aviation industry. That is a serious problem, and we need more policy incentives and market incentives to encourage the introduction and experimentation of a wider range of options. And evidence of this is that every time I go and talk with people about aviation, almost everyone's talking about SAF. This industry is obsessed with SAF. And I understand why that is, because if you can have a simple drop-in fuel that solves all the problems and doesn't require anybody to change anything else, then great. Then you go back to doing what you were doing, and you're optimized around doing the familiar, and you continue to be optimized around doing the familiar. My assessment of SAF is that after HEFA, I'm not sure SAF scales. It might not. It's very expensive. And there's been a lot of commingling of HEFA SAF with next generation SAF, and not a lot of serious grappling with the risks of potential scaling. Also, frankly, not enough serious grappling with the area where ZeroAvia potentially is most valuable, which is around contrail avoidance, which is a very simple, or could be a very simple but very, very important win for the aviation business. Depending on how you see the science, contrail avoidance could be a profound early opportunity to make big reductions in radiative forcing from aviation, and something that is that's quite tangible, and probably isn't going to happen with conventional jet fuels. Maybe a little bit with reformulated SAF, maybe not. We don't really know. Clearly, the kinds of solutions that you're looking at would be much more durable for the contrails problem. Before I move on, I want to just say one more thing in this second domain, which is to just pick up a little bit on hydrogen. We have to be cautious. A lot of the world's industries are looking to hydrogen as a ubiquitous feedstock. like electricity, but for molecules. That's great. But a lot of folks are also very excited about green hydrogen. I'd say the evidence so far is that green hydrogen is very expensive. My own view is that you should allow the rainbow of hydrogen and not just do green hydrogen. I'm also aware the politics lead people to want to do green hydrogen and rather than say blue hydrogen, which is carbon capture and storage put on steam reforming of natural gas. Those are unknown questions right now, but we have to be super cautious that we don't double down on one hydrogen pathway and basically send the ship to the deep because that pathway turns out to be the wrong pathway. So that's the second thing I want to say, which is about the logic of uncertainty and experimentalism applied to the aviation sector, and in particular, the risk of overweighting the familiar, and why I'm so encouraged by what you're doing, which is, I think, not overweighting the familiar. The third of the four things I want to say concerns the policy landscape. So much is happening out there that what you see is chaos. All kinds of different policies, European policies, UK policies, American policies. We'll see what happens after January 20th with American policies at the federal level, but there'll be American policies at the state level, all kinds of other initiatives. Some airports are doing this. It's chaotic. The chaos is not a bug, it's a feature. It's a feature of the political environment in which we're operating, where everyone is trying to figure out what they can do about the problem, and they're all pulling different levers. Some of the levers are important. A lot of the levers are not important. Everyone gets to look like they're doing something about the problem. And the result is you have a landscape where you don't do what my economist friends think are the ideal policy instruments, which is a simple carbon tax, revenue recycling, although some of the EUTS behaves that way. But instead, you have this kind of dog's breakfast of policy instruments that are kind of chaotic. That's normal. And a lot of people complain about it. Like, don't complain about it. It's like complaining about gravity. You're not going to solve the problem. Instead, what I think is going to be very important is to identify the policy instruments that really matter the most. And I'm going to identify three. One is demand. The parts of the next generation SAF market, for example, that are doing the best are places where demand is most confident. Highly reliable demand and offtake arrangements lead to investment. There's a terrific study that Bloomberg New Energy Finance did in March of last year at their conference in Munich, where they asked a bunch of clean tech investors to identify the factors that explain why some investments work and other investments don't work. Number one, by far on the list, is reliable demand. So translate that into your business. Are there places to create reliable demand for routes and aircraft and so on? Second are niches. Disruptive technological revolutions are expensive, and because they're disruptive, existing organizations don't like them. They block them. They lock them out. The book by Clay Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma, which is a phenomenal business book that has nothing to do with climate change and really is one of the best books on climate change, is about why organizations overweight the familiar. So you got to find some way to open up a niche market, particular routes, city pairs, particular places where governments care a lot about climate change. And there are many familiar examples, including that would be relevant to ZeroAvia, but identifying those niches and doubling down on those niches is the key to creating a reliable market. From there, the technologies can improve through learning and through investment and so on, and then be scaled up more widely. Disruptive technological revolutions do not happen through global committees. They happen through niches where the technology learns how to walk and then to fly in our case, and then becomes more cost effective and has higher performance. And the third thing of the three kind of policy areas where in this whole chaotic dog's breakfast of policy, you think three things that really matter. The third are tangible wins. Contrail avoidance and the valuation of contrail avoidance is a clear example of that. And if there are ways to create that valuation, I think this industry will start to double down on a whole range of technologies, including yours. I'd say right now we're good at talking about this, but not actually very good at doing, if I can paraphrase Yoda in that context. Fourth and last thing I just want to say four things in my opening remarks is about investors. There's a disconnect in the investment world. There's a massive amount of capital in aviation. Nearly all of that capital goes into low risk, debt-like instruments such as aircraft leases and acquisitions. That's a world that hates risk. That's a world that hates any kind of repayment concerns. That's a world that is going to continue to do what we're doing right now, which is refleeting and changes the margin and avoiding disruption, such as life. The other part of capital, which is much more equity at risk, where there's a huge amount of capital needed. The returns are unknowable right now. That's your world. And we've got to find a way in the industry overall to have more of the latter without disrupting the former. If we disrupt the former, then the aviation business as a whole is going to become opposed to action on climate change. They're going to become the enemy because this is going to get in the way of what they do as their core business. But if we don't do more of the latter, and there are some examples of the latter, including ZeroAvia, if we don't do more of the latter, the higher risk, including public-private arrangements, public-backed loans, and so on, then we are guaranteed to overweight the familiar. And overweighting the familiar produces a future for aviation that's a lot like today, that is a future of shallow decarbonization and not deep decarbonization, and is a future that doesn't actually solve the underlying climate problem. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Professor Victor. That was absolutely fascinating. So just a couple of questions, well, a couple of questions from me, and then I'll turn to some of the Q&A from our audience. You kind of you talked about we got a panel coming up with policymakers. You talked about some of the kind of three key areas that they should focus on amid the chaos to try and get the industry past this penchant for the familiar, essentially. I'm just curious as to what do you think are the key practical steps that what else could they introduce to chaos that actually would make a difference?
Yeah, I think there's one way to approach this question, which is a very good question, Dominic, is the policymakers are going to be talking to a lot of people in the industry, and everyone in the industry is going to be telling them almost the same thing, which is we need technologies that are low risk, that can be drop in and so on. Thus, they're going to be obsessed about SAF. That's guaranteed to happen. And frankly, if non-HEFA-SAF scales, because HEFA-SAF is going to run out of steam very soon, maybe already has, if non-HEFA-SAF scales, then fantastic. I see there's a whole domain of policy that's around that. I see there's also a domain of policy that is designed to be disruptive, that should be overweighting the tails of distribution. If you think about the stuff we know how to do is in the kind of middle part of the normal distribution, overweight the tails of distribution. That's the second area. That's classically a function for government R&D programs, although many government R&D programs, when you look closely at them, actually they also overweight the familiar. And so that's a risk. But the question I would be asking of the policymakers, not just on your panel, but on a regular basis, is what are you doing to really push out on the tails of distribution so that we as a society engage in a whole range of potential innovations and not just the familiar ones. Last little thing I'll say here is a footnote, which is this is expensive, and no country on its own can do all this itself. And so there's a big premium on a serious international cooperation among countries that want to do stuff. My country won't be one of those countries for the next 4 years, such is life. It's unfortunate. It's an understatement of the century. But other countries are already willing to do it, and other regions are willing to do it. And so the Clean Energy Ministerial, which could be one mechanism for doing that, pretty active. I would get them to be a little less of a talk shop and more of a, here's how we do an R&D portfolio that's global, because the technologies that, if they're successful, will be global technologies.
On the you talk a lot about risk averse industry, airlines generally, often the leasing companies, big capital tied up there. You can also see governments occasionally as being risk averse. They don't like to invest in things that maybe don't end up as the ultimate solution. So have you addressed that anywhere in your work, looking at the kind of risk averseness of governments to act on, whether it's in R&D portfolios or otherwise?
Absolutely. I mean, governments are risk averse because for at least two reasons. One is governments are run by voters, and the voters tend not to want people to launch themselves off into some unknown stratosphere. And then governments are organizations, and organizations overweight things they know how to measure and returns, and especially organizations that are publicly accountable. Because if you go take some wild risk and then it doesn't work out, then you are harmed, you're hurt in the political process because you took that risk. And so, as a general rule, the portfolios of R&D of technology the government's back are underweighting risk. But there are lots of institutions that do this pretty well. In the U.S., the ARPA institutions, DARPA institutions is an analog in in energy philanthropy now. This is not government, but this is private sector. There's growing evidence that philanthropic investment in high tech takes bigger risks and is a more rational, high risk portfolio than even most government programs. Last thing I'll say about this, though, is that many governments are doing industrial policy, including industrial policy on aviation. What we in the industry and the analyst community need to be doing is constantly pushing them and probing them about how they know they're taking enough risk, because almost all the metrics and the accountability mechanisms are lower risk rather than high risk.
That's interesting stuff. So just you kind of mentioned ARPA-E, you mentioned a couple of institutions that do this well. Can you think of any big sector examples where there has been this level of success? Maybe it's through public-private partnership that hydrogen aviation can learn from.
Yeah, I mean, the famous case is Skunk Works. And of course, that had a funder that was, not too worried about cost and very interested in pushing the envelope. One of the things you do learn from looking at Skunk Works, though, is this point about Clay Christensen. One of the reasons it could operate is because it was purposefully kept separate from the rest of the institution, from the rest of Lockheed. I mean, to the point where your key card, if you worked in the rest of Lockheed, wouldn't work in the Skunk Works building. And that may be a little extreme, but there is a larger organizational point here, which is that if you're going to do a public-private partnership to engage in this kind of higher risk activity, it all else equal probably benefits from being outside, if not actually formally distinct from the conventional status quo players, because the conventional status quo players will destroy it. The challenge is, how do you do that in a way that doesn't ignore all the lessons that come from, obeying the laws of physics and learning how to manufacture stuff. But as a general rule, these things are better done at an arm's length or further from existing institutions.
Terrific. And I've got one final question for you, if that's okay. I appreciate that you've been had lengthy travel coming back from London, so I hope you're at least enjoying the better weather in Southern California right now.
I won't tell you about the weather in Southern California.
Oh yeah, that's appreciated. Publish or perish. So you've given us an overview of some of your most interesting and recent thinking and publications. I'm just curious, is there anything you can trail in terms of what's the key question you're really looking to address next in your research? If it's not too IP sensitive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm an academic, and so in an old school sense, so nothing is IP sensitive. Anyone who wants to listen, other than my mother, I'm happy to talk. The thing that we're working on right now is human behavior. This happens to be focused on electric vehicles, where when people plug in their vehicles has a big impact on the demand on the grid. And it's a human behavior question, not just an engineering question. There are a lot of human behavior questions in transportation. High-speed transportation modes where you have to use common carriers, unless you're rich enough to have a private jet or whatever it is. High-speed transportation options are highly constrained by the way the common carrier system operates, but they also involve a lot of individual human choices. And I think there's a whole frontier of research questions around how variations in human behavior and human understanding of the right behaviors, how that then affects demand for energy. That's what we're working on now.
Terrific. No, fascinating. Just one very quick one, because we have one from our audience here, which I think you covered to some degree, but Jonathan Sumner asks, is perhaps the biggest threat or barrier to successful adoption of hydrogen aviation the fact that so many other industries will see it as the solution? And therefore, so again, that kind of, maybe it's that demand challenge from lots of different sectors creating a challenge. So is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I see it slightly differently. I see the big danger in aviation is that lots of other sectors want the same fats and oils. And so that's an immediate danger where you've got, think about biodiesel, think about bunker fuels and so on. So there's a lot of competition for the same feedstock, and the feedstock is highly limited. On the case of hydrogen, I think this is mostly a beneficiary. If a lot of other sectors want hydrogen, either for direct combustion or as a feedstock, that's going to be good for aviation. I am very, very worried, though, that the obsession with green hydrogen, which plays well politically, is going to lead the hydrogen revolution to be less robust than it could be, because it's not obvious to me that green hydrogen is the way to get the industry going.
I'm sure we'll have some more conversation on that topic later.
I'm sure
That's
I'm going to
terrific.
have
Thank
to
you very
X-ray
much.
my mail.
One of the requests for you, could you hold up your book again if you have it next to you? Because there's audience members asking for where they can
Fixing the
find it on
Climate.
Amazon.
and I'm going to get filthy rich from every copy sold.
My wife is an academic, and I know that's not true, but yeah, terrific, superb. Well, thank you, David Victor. We're going to move